Good news. Research shows that caring, not greed, is humanity's default tendency, according to renowned social scientist, cultural historian, and attorney Riane Eisler. Although it may look different when we turn on the news today and we're bombarded with messages of violence and greed, Riane Eisler's new book, Nurturing Our Humanity: How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future, provides evidence that caring behavior is actually humanity's default tendency, and that we can build more humane and sustainable societies by moving from a system of domination to one of partnership. Welcome, Riane. Thank you so much for joining me.
And it is such a pleasure to be with you again.
I loved the chalice and the blade. You have always been such an icon in bringing us events and history that shows how we can shape our society. And this is a beautiful, beautiful book. So thank you. All right, so let's talk about some of the evidence in society that showed domination types of society. So we can see the difference, and then we'll move into partnership-based societies. So let's talk a little bit about the domination types of society and what those look like.
Well, I'm going to back up a little bit to say that these are new categories. And as Einstein said, we really cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. And linguistic psychologists have long told us that the categories provided by a culture's language actually shape our thinking. So when I started this research, which was to answer the question of really what kind of society supports our positive human capacities, rather, because we still also have those, our negative ones, it became very clear that right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, all of these conventional categories, well, for one thing, there have been repressive, oppressive, violent societies in all these categories. So I started to look at a much larger picture, and we can get back to that. And what became evident are some social configurations that keep repeating themselves, not only cross-culturally, but historically. And it's always a matter of degree. It's a partnership domination scale. But on the domination end, well, you have societies that are so very different, really. Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, ISIS, Khomeini's Iran. Now, some are religious, some are Eastern, some are Western, but they all share the configuration of the domination system. And
Yes.
They have a very top-down authoritarian structure in both. And this is really vital in both the family and the state or tribe.
Now, you lived this firsthand. You were a refugee in Nazi Germany and Europe, and you have had incredible survival skills. Tell me what you experienced, and how does that relate to what you're talking about here?
Well, the question that I wanted to answer is what kind of society will support our positive human capacities, which are enormous for caring, for creativity, for consciousness, or alternately inhibit them and instead support our capacities for cruelty, for insensitivity, for violence. Those really came out of my childhood. As a child refugee with my parents from Nazi Austria, where I was born.
And that, I mean, I'd love to hear your view of it as a child.
Well, my view of it as a child was horror, trauma. But out of this trauma came these questions about, does it have to be this way? And if not, what are the alternatives? And as I said, to really see the alternatives, we have to leave our comfort zones, which are the old categories and the old ways of thinking. Because remember, I said that I had to look beyond conventional categories that right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. And why? Because they really cannot, they each look at a particular aspect of society, but most strikingly, and this I really have to emphasize, none of them really take into account the relationship between what happens in our primary human relations,
Mm.
childhood, gender, the relations that children first experience and observe in families,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and what happens in politics and economics. And in fact, most of these categories uh, pay scant, if any, attention to these primary human relations.
How was your primary human relationship with your parents during that experience?
Well, I think my parents were traumatized as well,
Of
of
course.
course.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, adults, my father was on Crystal Night, so-called, because of all the glass that was broken in Jewish homes and synagogues and businesses. My father was pushed down the stairs. I mean, I remember that very
Mm.
vividly by Gestapo men who came to our house. But my mother, and this was really a miracle, frankly, she stood up to them. She recognized
Wow.
one of the men as a former errand boy for the family business, and she got furious.
Oh.
I mean, how dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you,
Mm.
to you? And she could have been killed. Many people were killed that night by the Nazis, but by, as I said, really by a miracle. And I think that kind of dominator authoritarian personality responds to authority. And my mother exerted authority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And eventually money passed hands, of course, but she got him back.
Oh.
And he escaped. And my parents were able to purchase entry permits to Cuba. But that's all they could do because they couldn't take anything with them. Um, and I grew up, at least, at first in dire poverty in Havana, which was also traumatic. And at that time in Batista's Cuba, the gaps between haves and have-nots were horrendous.
Mm.
So
Yes.
it was difficult for them and for me. I mean, their energy went into getting back on their feet.
Yes. Yes. And were you an only child?
Yes.
So you were very closely tied with your parents' level of survival. And you saw this, how these dominant societies really impacted you and your family firsthand.
Absolutely. I mean, this comes out of my childhood
Mm-hmm.
experiences. And childhood experiences, which is what is really focused on to some, I mean, this book it's a systems analysis, but one of the things it really looks at is what we know from neuroscience
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
about childhood.
About how it shapes the brain, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, unfortunately, if it's taught in our universities at all, it's sort of, it's in some psychology class, in some neuroscience class. It really needs to be part of the whole curriculum, especially sociology, economics, political science, because of this link that is really shown by my research and by not only my research, but the research of my co author in Nurturing Our Humanity, between the social behaviors and the family behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
between the family structure and the social structure.
Now, equally, you researched these societies where there were partnership-based societies. And if you could give us a glimpse into that so that we could understand how possibly a better brain is shaped.
Well, there is a lot of evidence, and I keep wondering how so many people in universities and in the media and in the public at large can cling to the old story. And you know the old story. It's either original sin or selfish genes. And why they argue with each other is beyond me because it's the same story.
Yeah.
They're bad.
Yes.
We have to be controlled from the top.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Patriarchal type of domination. Yes.
right, a domination society. And um, I'll start with going back way into our cultural evolution, and especially the work of my co-author, the anthropologist Douglas Fry, who is probably one of the top authorities in the world today on foraging societies.
Hmm.
And this is how we humans lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And I already allude to that in The Chalice and the Blade, if you remember.
Yes.
I didn't go back as far. In nurturing our humanity, there is, of course, very strong evidence that, as Doug likes to put it, the people who cling to the old story, unfortunately, uh, somehow seem to ignore the facts.
Well, yes. In now in their back thousands of years into our caveman days, you see this existing where there was a dominant type of hieroglyphics. You see it in pictures and so forth. How did you find societies that were partnership based? Where in the world did you find those
Well, what we
societies?
found, first of all, already in The Chalice and the Blade, uh, when I was looking through these lenses of the partnership and domination systems, I found that, contrary to popular beliefs, until about 10,000 years ago, there was no war. I mean, a society like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, which already was not a foraging society, it was a early farming and animal husbandry society. There were no signs of destruction through warfare for 1,000 years.
And how did you tell that? How did you discover that?
Well, archaeologists discovered that. And one of the archaeologists who is now excavating in Çatalhöyük um, emphasized in a piece that he wrote for, as a matter of fact, for the Scientific American some time ago, uh, that actually there were there there are absolutely no signs of gender inequality
Huh. So in a
in these
way,
societies.
I could see where you could see there's no evidence of war if you didn't find weapons or walls, large, walls or
That's
barriers.
right.
But how did you find evidence of gender equality?
Well, he found it in not only the grave goods, but for women and for men, but also in the DNA evidence
Hmm.
and in the
Fascinating.
development. But what Doug found, now let's now go back millennia, thousands of years, is the same configuration of the partnership system, uh, much more egalitarian families and tribal societies, much more gender equity, and much less violence. In fact, Doug calls these early societies the original partnership societies.
That
But
is amazing.
we don't have to go back, by the way, to caveman days. And I really want to say something. That's not what children are taught. Remember the caveman
Right.
cartoon? In one hand he has a club, a weapon, with another he's dragging a woman by the hair.
Right.
So before children's brains are formed, much less their critical faculties come in, children are taught that male dominance, violence, domination.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's how it's always been, and by implication, that's how it always will be.
Why was
And
the evidence of these early societies deleted or not taught in schools or even in early parenting?
because we have a domination heritage,
Mm-hmm.
and it is, look, out of 1,600 years approximately of so-called modern Western science, it was only 50 years ago, that women's studies even entered the university, and then men's studies, gender studies, queer studies. But today, even today, that's just marginalized. It's
Yes.
just off to one place. It isn't taught generally. And in Nurturing Our Humanity, there are tons of citations, by the way, hundreds of pages. But as you know, it's a very accessible book too.
Yes.
Very exciting book.
Yes.
What we know is that I cite a book by a historian of science called David Noble called A World Without Women. Now, I mention this because so-called modern Western science originated in a monastic, celibate, and very actually misogynist uh, environment.
Yes.
Uh, of the early church monks. Not only, I mean, the only way women were involved, at least officially, was to clean and cook, right?
And that's what was documented. That's what we have been taught.
Yeah.
And that's what
So,
we are reading. Yes.
so the thing is, I mean, in I think in the Chalice and the Blade. And by the way, if people are going to buy the Chalice and the Blade, please buy. It's now in its 56th printing.
My goodness. My goodness. And
Please buy the latest printing because I wrote a new epilogue, bringing it up to date
yes.
For the 30th anniversary.
It's amazing that you have a book that is 50 plus years old, that you have, or 56 printing, yes. How many years old is it?
30 years.
30 years old.
30 years old. But in it, I mentioned, as an example of how blinkered scientists have been, the wrong way arrows freeze from the so-called Stone Age. There is this frieze with an animal, a deer with antlers, and some sticks which were interpreted as wrong way arrows. And then Alexander Marshak, who was not trained in archaeology, and it hadn't been drummed into him, the worldview, he said, wait a minute, under a microscope, we see that these aren't wrong way arrows, they're vegetation. And the branches are going the right way. And it really depicts the coming of spring, including the antlers, which grow in the spring. But that is not how they saw
No.
it. They saw it as a story of man the hunter, man the warrior.
Yes, yes.
And the fact that there are no warrior scenes in the art until about 10,000 years ago didn't make any difference. They saw them.
Interesting.
Even when they weren't there.
Right. That became the meme. Now, there are societies that exist today in Sweden and in Finland and in Norway where the partnership-based societies do exist, and there are lower crime rates there. There's more of a medium income, the middle class. It's not such a division between the upper and the lower class. Can you tell us a little bit about those societies?
Yes, and I'm so glad that you brought that up because it isn't, as I said, that we have to go back to caves or to early agricultural societies. There has been movement towards partnership, especially in the last 300 years. But the societies that have been at the forefront of that movement towards the partnership side are these Northern European societies. And what we see there, it's not that they're socialist. They have a very healthy market economy. It's not because they're small and relatively homogeneous. Look at other relatively homogeneous small societies, Saudi Arabia, for example, very domination oriented in everything. It's because we can see the partnership configuration. For one thing, they have much more democracy and equality in both the family and the state. They have much more gender parity. They have the lowest gender gaps. They still have some, unfortunately, because we have this legacy from about, 5,000, 10,000 years ago of domination. But women are 40 to 50% of the national legislature.
Wow.
And
Interesting.
what happens is that as the status of women rises, not only women, but men begin to change this idea that to be real men, they can't be like a woman, right? So caring, caregiving, nonviolence can enter policy. And they pioneered investing in what we today call, I don't like the term, high quality human capital.
Wow.
People,
Yes.
you know, child care, very
That's the
generous paid
term.
parental leave, etc. But the third thing, and I really want to mention this because this is not coincidental, it's a configuration. These nations pioneered not only the first laws saying that physical discipline of children is against the law, but the first peace studies.
Wow, that's extraordinary. So there is a law against physical challenging behavior against children in some of these countries.
In
That's
all
fantastic.
of these
All of
countries,
the countries.
they all followed it, and by now about 50 countries have followed, not the United States,
Yeah.
even though the American Psychological Association finally said not only is spanking ineffective as a way of, disciplining, but it's harmful.
Oh, it breaks the trust between the parent and the child forever. It does.
Forever. I mean, and it's so ironic, isn't it? Because, I taught a class because I teach about my work online, and this one woman kept saying, but spanking isn't violence. And it was really bizarre because she, but of course, you wouldn't hit, if you hit your coworker
Right.
who
That's
makes you do
violence.
something, you go to jail. But hitting this smaller, dependent, helpless child, that's not against the law. And
That's
that
got to
is
change.
insane. It has to
It has to
change.
change. I'm curious, in these countries that are partnership based, is there a high divorce rate? And what does divorce do to the partnership model in a relationship, in a family?
Well, it's so interesting that you bring up the issue of divorce because there were two really major factors in the high divorce rate here in the United States. One was women no longer being so dependent.
Okay, so they're more independent.
Yeah, well, if you are totally dependent, like it used to be that women could not work outside the home without their husband's permission. As an attorney, I can put a lot of dots together. I mean, that's my work. It's systems work. And of course, ignored dots, hugely ignored dots.
Gaps.
But I don't think that the divorce rate is any higher in the Northern European nations as it is here. And I know divorce is difficult for children, but I want to say that it's very difficult for children to live in households in which there is domination.
Okay.
And the ACEs studies, the adverse childhood experiences studies, which of course are described in Nurturing Our Humanity, are longitudinal studies of people who have experience of large samples of people, and what they found is that the extent of adverse childhood abuse, neglect, um, all kinds of issues, substance problems in families, um, and strangely, divorce really wasn't one of the things that was listed as one of the adverse childhood
Great.
experiences.
That's fantastic. That's great news. That's fantastic news. So back to the dominance trance that we're in as a society, as you were describing earlier. How do we wake up from that dominance trance?
Well, the domination trance is something that I woke up from it.
Yes.
I mean, I want to tell you that I have my life is sort of like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together, but one piece of it was being an attorney. And I remember that when the head of the firm that I was working for, it was a Beverly Hills entertainment firm, which is where I was. I thought it would be entertaining. Called me into his office to commend me for something. He said, you don't think like a woman. And I took it as a compliment.
Uh-huh.
Not only did he think it was a compliment, but this insult, really,
Yes.
I took it as a compliment.
At the
So
time.
I know we can wake up.
So you thought that was a good thing at the time.
Oh, I
Now,
thought it was wonderful.
yes.
Hey, and then I thought, oh my God.
It's an insult. So we have at some point to be shown these differences and to wake up from the trance and to expose and become aware of this dominance model that we've been shown for thousands of years. And there's also the partnership model, which you show. How can we start to move more towards that partnership model?
Well, the Nurturing Our Humanity ends with 4 cornerstones that we have to shift from domination to partnership. But again, I want to back up for a minute to put it in context. Because as I said, for the last 300 years, because of the dislocations of the Industrial Revolution, there has been one movement after another challenging traditions of domination, from the so-called rights of man movement, challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule, the feminist movement challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over women and children, the the abolitionist, civil rights, anti-colonial movements challenging the so-called divinely ordained, again, right of a quote superior race to rule over inferior ones, all the way to the environmental movement challenging man's once hallowed conquest of nature and other traditions of domination that at our level of technological development could really do us in, as we're seeing. But
Dominance over nature, I see what you're talking. Yes, yes.
yeah, these movements have really focused most of their energy on trying to dismantle the top of the domination pyramid, politics and economics as conventionally defined. And they have paid far less attention to the foundations on which the domination system rebuilds itself, whether it's fascist, whether it's communist, whether it's Eastern, whether it's religious or secular or Western. And the 4 cornerstones start with childhood.
Okay.
Why? Well, neuroscience, for goodness sakes, which is also still marginalized in the academy, by
But
the
it's
way.
how our brains are formed. Yes, I understand that. But yes.
Shows 85% of our brain architecture is formed in the first 5 years, and that what children first experience and observe impacts this enormously because the brain develops in interaction with its environment, which is for us mainly cultural, of course, and transmitted through, yes, family, religion, education, politics, economics too, but for children, that is primary. So when we were talking about, how do we change it? We join in a campaign, really, to change this notion that it's okay to hit children, because what do children really learn? Why is this so important? For whether it's Khomeini in Iran, or for Hitler, or for Stalin, or for ISIS, to go back to a quote traditional family,
Yes.
which is code for an authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive.
That's what traditional means. Okay.
Yeah, highly punitive family. Why? Because it's foundational. What do kids learn when violence is used in their family by one person to impose their will on others?
They learn domination again. Yes.
They learn it's okay to use force to impose their will on others.
So you said in order to reverse this model or go more towards a partnership model, you need to get to the base of the pyramid. So if it's a top-down structure, the foundation is what you're looking to reinforce. So how could we, so reinforcing the family, reinforcing, you said 4 cornerstones. One is
So the
childhood.
first is childhood. So really, violence and abuse, I mean, parenting education is something that you get in Northern European countries.
Now, yes.
We know that authoritative, because kids do need limits, rather than authoritarian, much and certainly not violent parenting, is essential for really healthy brain development.
That's a great distinction. Authoritarian versus authoritative. 2 different
Right,
things.
because I mean, because see, a lot of what we saw in the 60s was rebellion rather than reconstruction.
Yes.
And what this work provides is the roadmap to reconstruction, to an alternative.
Well, we're seeing that now. We're seeing rebellion instead of reconstruction now. So that's a very good point. Yes.
Yeah, and we really need to be able to, and the second cornerstone is gender, of course.
Gender. Okay.
And why? Have you noticed that getting women back into their, quote, traditional place, right? Subservient place in this family has been a priority for those pushing us back, not just ISIS or the Taliban or Khomeini, but for the so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance, which came together, by the way, first to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment.
Wow.
A women's issue.
Huh, interesting.
Think about it. And they have spent enormous money, resources, time, energy in pushing the normative ideal for family back. I don't know, I think you're too young to remember the Promise Keepers, where men were given a choice of either control your family or leave.
Oh, no, I wasn't aware of that, yes.
And in 2007, I wrote an op-ed for Alternet saying, look, we've got something to learn here. We've got to really not let them get away with this family values thing, because surveys show that what they showed is amazing, that when people were asked, do you agree that the father is the master of the house?
Yes.
The percentage over a period of 10 years jumped 10 points.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, we're actually going to take a look here at a video where Riane is talking, and this is a TEDx talk that she did, about 4 actions we can take. Take a look here.
I am going to invite you to join me in 4 actions. 4 actions that every one of us can take, that every one of you can take, to really move us to new ways of thinking about economics and structuring economics. The first, changing the conversation about economics. Einstein said it, you cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. Yeah. So we really need something different. We need economic systems that recognize something that once articulated may sound perfectly self-evident, which is that the real wealth of our nation, the real wealth of the world, is not financial. And we certainly saw that, didn't we, with the meltdown of all of those derivatives, all of those credit swaps into thin air, right? The real wealth of our nation, of the world, consists of the contributions of people and of nature. So we need what we have not had, economic systems that give visibility and real value to the most essential human work, the work of caring for people and caring for our Mother Earth. Now, just putting caring and economics in the same sentence, a lot of people do a double take, don't they? We're just not used to that. But think about it. Isn't that a terrible comment on the distorted values we have learned to accept as driving our economic systems? So we really There are many reasons that we've accepted this, but one of the reasons is what I mentioned. The economic indicators that obscure reality, that don't really show these distorted values or the tremendous suffering, the environmental damage, the hunger, the poverty that result from them. And that takes us to our second action, changing the economic indicators. You know, if you really look at GDP, it is crazy. Gross domestic product, and you know, we see it everywhere, don't we? I mean, that's the thing that's trotted out. Did you know that it actually includes, as quote, productive work, activities that harm and even take life? Making cigarettes, for example, the medical bills, the funeral costs, they're great for GDP. They're all in there. Natural disasters, oil spills, hey, the cleanup costs, the lawsuit, all of the, depositions, expert witnesses, all go into GDP. But not only do these measures fail to put negatives in as negatives, in fact, they put in negatives as positives, but they do not include the work as productive that contributes the most to human well-being. And by this, I mean the life-sustaining activities of three economic sectors, that we have to start taking into account: the household economy, the natural economy, and the volunteer community economy. We need, my friends, a full spectrum economic map, and then we can have measures that accurately reflect reality.
Riane, in that video, you talked about the work of women's work, caring for the elderly and caring for children, actually being a part of the GDP, and that it is undervalued. Can you explain that?
Well, that takes me to the fourth cornerstone, economics, because both socialism and capitalist theory really ignored the economic value of caring for people starting in early childhood and caring for our Mother Earth. I mean, nature was there for both Marx and Smith to be exploited. Women, as late as when Marx wrote in the 1800s, if a woman couldn't even sue for injuries negligently imposed to her, only her husband could for loss of her services.
Oh, my goodness.
So that's what they internalized. So GDP follows that script. So it includes, of course, it's crazy, it includes as, quote, productive, as I said in that video, things that kill us, and yet it ignores the economic value of the work of caring for people starting in early childhood, even though we know today, because we have got sophisticated new metrics to measure, and a recent Australian study showed that if the caregiving work performed in families were included in the Australian GDP, it would be 50% of the reported Australian GDP.
That makes sense if you consider how much it costs for caregivers, for senior living facilities, for child care, for housework. If you add all of that up, yes, it is a full-time job. It absolutely is.
And it's not only that, because the Australian study was higher because it not only used market value, but it also used what is called in statistics lost of, opportunity cost.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So it used the average Australian wage to add to for the time spent. And that's so it depends. See, if you just do market value, because we have such low market value for care work, and so many of the care workers in the market have to be on welfare, actually.
So there is a study that your organization did, the partnership, is it the Center for Partnership Studies?
That's right. That we have developed new measures that we are now working to put into a much simpler form. They're called social wealth economic indicators. And what we're working on is a social wealth index, just two numbers rather than the 26 we found. But what the social wealth indicators measure is something that's left out of even most GDP alternatives, which is the value, as I just said, of the work of caring for people, especially in our post-industrial age, when, you know, human capacity, high quality human capital, economists tell us is the most important capital. And it also, of course, takes into account women and children, the status of women and children. In fact, we did one study at CPS showing that actually the status of women in a society is a powerful predictor of general quality of life. And we see this in the Northern European nations,
Yes.
as I mentioned.
So, and also there's a return on investment that hasn't
It's
also been
huge.
factored in of a caregiver.
And it's huge. But the problem is that we're so used to thinking just now, you know, like grazing animals, I think of it sometimes, rather than planning for the future. But we're well into the post-industrial era. And if we don't invest in caring for children, and if we don't, in this time of climate change and other threats environmentally,
Yes.
invest in caring for our life support systems, we really have no future. So this is very realistic.
Yes. Now, I want to just go back to the four cornerstones. You spoke about child raising, you spoke about education and economics, and there was a third one.
Yes, and that is language and narratives or stories. Remember what I said about language, and this is why I've really had to introduce new language. The domination system and the partnership system, because look, these categories look at things that are left out, gender relations, and which is insane, you know, because how girls and boys are brought up in rigid domination systems, these stereotypes, they shape what they think it means to be human, right?
Yes. Well, I like that you're talking about changing the narrative. And
Yes.
that is truly what does need to happen.
Absolutely. And that's what my work does.
Yes.
Really. That's what all these books do, from The Chalice and the Blade all the way to Nurturing Our Humanity.
Yes.
But Nurturing Our Humanity also, of course, provides the missing reason for the configuration. And that comes from neuroscience.
Well, go ahead. Yes, the brain.
And I say that we're back to what we started with. You know, what you said, the story that we're told is, well, too bad. But, you know, either it was original sin, which is a bizarre story, or it was, you know, evolutionary imperatives, right?
Yes.
Which are false, absolutely false. The default, what studies reported in Nurturing Our Humanity, for example, show through brain imaging is that the so-called pleasure centers of our brains light up more when we share than when we win.
That's the default. So caring is the default. That the reward center light up more when we compassionately care for one another than when we don't, right?
Look, we get endorphins not only when we are cared for, but when we care for others, even caring for a pet.
Really? Oh, that's wonderful.
It gives chemical rewards.
Yes.
It's part of what it means to be human.
Well, there is a segment that I love to do here in the show, and it's called the Aware News. And in this segment, we talk about current events and how it relates to your current body of work in order to provide possibilities and solutions for a better world. And there is right now a very strong division in this country of the right versus the left. And it is ripping families apart in this particular country. And according to an article that I found in The Atlantic, 39% of respondents said that they see political diversity within their families, 39%. So there's even divisiveness within each parts between the parties. So how do we close that gap? And how do we have this conversation of domination versus partnership within our own families and within our own political parties?
It's very difficult, but the hopeful thing about within families is that even some of the people who are brought up in domination systems have some kind of experience. I mean, I've talked to people where they see that there is a partnership alternative and that it feels better, that it is better. So let's look at the positives for a moment. But look, this is something that we can't really resolve through dialogue, because unfortunately studies also show that the brains of people who are really very damaged by becoming a domination or authoritarian personality, the part of the brain that makes it possible for them to change their perceptions is smaller.
So the part of the brain that goes towards the domination model is smaller?
Well, no, it isn't that it goes towards the domination model. I have to explain it to you.
Okay.
A long time ago, there was a psychologist called Else Frankel Brunswick, and she found that people who scored high on the F for fascist scale had a very difficult time when a picture of a dog gradually became a picture of a cat. They couldn't see the cat until ages later, but finally they did see it. But it took them forever. And then a psychologist, again, this is in Nurturing Our Humanity, called Amadio and his team, looked at the brains of people in a similar experiment. And the people who described themselves as extremely conservative, very conservative, which I think very left and very right are very often dominator personalities, by the way. But right and left are not the right categories. The real categories are the people who cling to the domination. They see only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated.
Okay. You're right. They can't exist in both parties. Absolutely.
Right.
In the extreme sides of both parties.
Yeah, right. So there is hope of getting some of the people that, 30, whatever percentage of Americans grow up in domination environments and somehow stick to them and have developed their brains that way. Some of them can change slowly, gently, gradually, by showing them a better alternative. That's why the Social Wealth Economic Index shows the benefits, the return on investment.
That's fascinating. I find, though, also that our younger generation tends to move more towards the center, and in politics and in families and so forth, bringing into balance that conversation politically. And it has to do with, as you say, the neuroscience, that our younger generation is brought up with more of a narrative about equality than our older generation.
And not only that, we know so much more about really what good child care is.
That's
today.
true. We have learned so much about parenting. And yes.
Even in the last 50 years, an explosion of knowledge, not all of it from neuroscience, from psychology, but most of that has only looked at the individual, the family. This work connects the dots between because why is there always enough money for the so-called prisons, right? The so-called punitive male head of the household stereotype, right? Domination stereotype. Or for weapons and wars, the domination male masculine stereotype of the hero as killer, but somehow there isn't enough money for caring for people. For caring for children, for health care, even though it's an essential investment in the future, this has a lot to do with our gendered system of values. If we can make people aware of that and how it adversely impacts not only them, but their children and their grandchildren.
I understand what you're saying. So in order to impact the outcome, which the result of a domination-based household is eventually what you find in prisons, if you back that all the way up to the raising of children, that it would impact the outcome of the prisons, and the money would go more towards funding childcare than would be towards funding prison systems.
It's a punitive approach. Remember, we talked about the domination family being highly punitive. People who grow up in these families go into denial about what they have to. Look, the people who cause them pain, who hit them, who punish them, who shame them, you cannot, as a child, as is dependent on these people, express your anger and pain and rage against them. But they are then taught by the authority figure that to deflect that anger against the out group.
Yes.
Whether the immigrant, the blacks, the Jews, and that's why you find this tangle. But I want to say something about gender, which is really something we have to understand. This is not a, quote, women's issue. It is a primary social issue, because if children observe and internalize a way of thinking of difference, beginning with the difference in form between male and female, as equated with superiority and inferiority, dominating and being dominated, being served and serving, before their brains are formed, before their critical faculties are formed, they have a template for all in-group versus out-group thinking.
Yes, yes, that's true. We do have a society that's largely based on that, and it is shifting. And so my question for you is, when we get into, say, the prison system and these different types of results of this domination type of society thinking, how do we impact it at that level? Yes, we get it about the child raising part of it, but what about at the later levels, the established levels?
People can change, and this is one of the marvelous things about the human brain. Now, it's much more difficult to change. Remember all the years of psychological psychoanalysis,
conditioning. Oh, yes.
And healing. We hear so much about healing. It's healing from the domination trance, really.
Okay, that makes sense. So it is possible to heal. The neuroscientists show us that the brain is malleable and that it can change. It just needs to be shown.
It needs to be shown. And remember, it's much easier to start in childhood than having to reverse all the damage, as the ACEs studies show, the adverse childhood experiences show, because the people in that sample not only had more psychological problems, but more disease, more physical problems.
Well, if you are a grandparent, then it's good to become aware of this and to learn more about it so that you can have a different experience with your grandchildren and not parent or co-parent the way that you parented. There's a generational divide here that can absolutely be healed from your book about nurturing humanity.
I think we have to understand that there are some things that can change now. Policy, support for caring for children, support for equality, support for paid parental leave, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
But that in the longer term is what we're really talking about. And that is hard for people to accept. They want change like that. And it doesn't happen like that.
Well, trust needs to be built. There's a long-term trust that needs to be built, that these systems, the nurturing systems, the partnership systems actually work.
And this is why language is so important. Because consider the only categories that we have that take gender into account are matriarchy or patriarchy.
Yes.
And they're really both two sides of a domination coin. Either men dominate or women dominate. Where's the partnership alternative? So we have to change our thinking. I had to invent new terms for hierarchy of domination and hierarchy of actualization. because, I mean, we need parents, we need teachers,
Yes.
we need managers, we need leaders, but remember the symbols of the chalice and the blade?
Yes.
They have two symbols for power. The blade, power over, right?
Mm-hmm.
The chalice is power to, power with, power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life. Power isn't bad. We just have to redefine it.
Redefine it. As you said, authority versus authoritarian. Well, thank you so much, Riane. You are just a wealth of knowledge and a gift to humanity. And thank you so much for the book, Nurturing Our Humanity. And if you'd like to watch more inspirational programming, you can check out my website at theawareshow.com, or you can reach out to me on Facebook at Lisa Garr Host. Thank you so much, Riane. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. I'm Lisa Garr, and until next time, I invite you to stay aware.